Hello, this is Jane Matthew, and welcome to the first video podcast for Music 302L, Introduction to Western Music. Today we're going to be following up on our conversation from Friday's class on the Protestant Reformation. As you'll recall, in class on Friday, we spent a whole bunch of time reading and talking to each other about different Reformation movements, specifically focusing on the ideological undercurrents of them, or rather, the ideas that each of the reformers had that caused the split. Today in this podcast, we're really going to be talking about the sounds and how these ideologies transferred into sound. As you recall, on Friday we started with this quote from St. Augustine of Hippo, really talking about the balance of words and music in worship services, that there was potentially a danger and something really at stake for creating music for worship, where we want to use this beautiful music to help in our worship service, to bring people to God and to praise God. But if we get too far away from that, there's potentially a dangerous element that can get us too far away from the real goal. So this quote is at the center of a lot of the different Reformation movements and how they split off from the Catholic Church. So today, some questions to explore as we move through the podcast, and questions to ask yourself as we go through. The first question is the same question that was up on the board on Friday. How do differences between religious ideologies, Catholic and Protestant, affect musical practice and worship? So we're going to be taking the ideas that we studied in class on Friday and trying to see how they actually translated into the creation of music and the role of the music in that worship practice. You can use this to contrast to the readings that you've done on Catholic traditions at the time, including the Josquin example that we talked about with the motet from right around 1500, as well as the Palestrina example that was right around 1600 that was a response to these different Protestant movements. But we can talk a little bit more about that in section this week. The other question I want you to ask really goes back to this St. Augustine of Hippo quotation that's just a step before here. It's really, what is the relationship between the words and music and the different worship rituals for these different ideologies and different Reformation movements? We can actually get a lot of information about what these people believed and how they believed it and how they practiced it by really focusing in on the relationship between the words and the music. Can you hear all of the words? Can you follow all of the words? So we're going to try and see if we can figure that out as we go through this podcast today. But before we get there, I'd like for you to take a second and go back through your notes and see if you can remember some of the reasons for the Reformation that happened right around 1500. This asks you to go back to the material from the pre-class quiz from Friday's lecture, specifically on what was going on in the Catholic Church leading up to this time period. So take a second and look through your notes, see if you can boil it down to a couple of different reasons. And from there, can you think of any musical reasons? If you're having trouble answering these questions right at this second, that's okay. Just make sure you can go back through your notes and through your textbook and see if that you can answer these questions before next week. So we're going to go through the three important branches of the Reformation. As we mentioned in class, there were many other Reformation movements, but these three are the most prominent and, for purposes of this class, the most important. We're going to go through them in order, and we're going to start with Martin Luther. So the genre that we associate with Martin Luther's services, the genre of music, I should say, is something called the Lutheran chorale. Mallory talked more about this a little bit at the end of her part of her lecture on Friday. But before we get there, look at your notes, and if you have the Luther reading, look at that Luther reading. How did Luther feel about the role of music in religious services? Was it important? Was it crucial? Was it dangerous and maybe to be avoided? Was it nice but really not terribly necessary to a worship practice? Or was it good but you really needed to have professional singers in order to pull it off? What do you think for the Lutheran chorale? What do you think Luther thought about this? Okay, now I'm going to play for you an example of a Lutheran chorale, and I'll put the text up, the words up with the translation in just a second. But as I play through this example, I want you to see if in your notebook or just in notes someplace else, if you can see if you can pick up on these different musical parameters that are functioning within this piece. What is the texture? What is the form? What is the instrumentation? And what is the language? All of these things can give us a whole lot of information as to getting at that question of the relationship between the words and the music for the Lutheran chorale. The example I'm going to be playing for you is a chorale called Ein Festeberg, and I'm going to play a couple of different versions for you. The first version was actually written by Martin Luther himself. He wrote the words and the main melody. So we're going to listen to a little bit of that version first, and then from there we'll listen to a couple of the other versions. Sorry about that.
Sein grausam Rüstung ist, auf ist nicht seins Gleichen.
Okay, so I had a little bit of trouble starting it right at the right spot, but go back and ask yourself, what is the texture? What is the form? What is the instrumentation or performing force? And what language is it in? Well, starting with the last one first, this might be perhaps the most obvious because you can actually see it on your screen. This is in German. Why might that be significant, though? Well, one of the things that we noted when we were looking at Luther's traditions was that he really wanted his worship service to be in the vernacular, or the language of the people. As we remember, all of the Catholic services were always in Latin, which was not necessarily a spoken language. Wherever you were, the service in Catholic, the Mass, was in Latin, and this is true up until the 1960s. One of Luther's biggest points in his worship service was that he wanted the people to be able to engage with music and with the service in a way that they would really be able to understand. And as such, all of the music was sung in the language of the people. So if you were living in Germany, as Luther was, you were going to sing in German. If you were in France, you were going to sing in French. It depended on where you were. It was going to be the language that you can see. So you can see clearly that this is in German. What about the instrumentation? We can see in this earliest form of the Lutheran chorale that it's just one voice, right? It's just one singer. And so we have one person singing, or we could all sing it together, but we would be singing together in one line. And we know that that means for texture that it's monophonic. In terms of form, what do you think that might be? You can go back and listen to it again, but see if you can hone in on the form of this one. Okay, I'm going to play another version for you. Very quickly after these original monophonic chorales were used, they started to be elaborated and set polyphonically. As Mallory mentioned in class, Luther was a big fan of music. He loved music, and in fact, he really loved the music of Josquin. So he starts taking this material and he works with other composers, and actually this arrangement, as you can see, is by Caspar Ohlmar, to create a polyphonic version that you might have heard in the service. Importantly, the melody is still going to be there and it's still going to be very prominent, so that the congregation could sing along with the melody, while other singers who are perhaps a little bit more professional filled in the rest of it. So let's listen to a little bit to that version. Okay, could you follow the melody along with this? It might be a familiar melody to you. If not, you can go back and listen to it again, rewind this podcast, and see if you can hear it one more time. So from here, we've talked about it. Lutheran chorales can be both monophonic and polyphonic, but generally, increasingly more so, they were going to be polyphonic, with one melody that would be particularly strong based off of the original monophonic melody. What does that mean for texture? That's right, it's going to be homophonic. Sometimes it's going to be completely homorhythmic, where everyone's going to be moving at the time. But the example that you heard before was more of a homophonic texture that was a little bit more melody and accompaniment. We can see that a Lutheran chorale from this definition that you can write down in your notebook is a strophic hymn in the Lutheran tradition, intended to be sung by the congregation, but increasingly, because the music would be more and more developed, parts of it would be sung by a trained choir. The important thing to remember is that the melody would always be clear and always be available to the congregation to sing along with the professional choirs. This is a really important aspect of the Lutheran tradition, is the participation, of the congregation in the ceremony. So let's move on and talk about Calvin and this idea of psalmody, which is another genre. Looking back into your notes, how did Calvin feel about the role of music? Same answers, but might be, or same options, but it's probably going to be a different answer. Okay, in order to answer this question, we're actually going to do a little bit of listening first. And again, I'm asking you the same questions here. What is the instrumentation? What is the language? What is the texture? What is the form? And in addition, I want you to think about what kind of worship experience this music creates. We're going to be hearing something called Psalm 100. It might be familiar to you, but see if you can find the language that it's in. Okay, so were you able to pick up on some of these things that I asked you to think about as you were listening to it? First one might be the most obvious. Instrumentation? Yeah, it's human voice again. But in this version, it's a lot of people singing in just one line, right? Did you notice what gender the people were, or could you hear gender set? Could you hear it? Well, in this version, we have both men and women singing. This is going to tell us some information. What language was it? Could you tell? Was it English? Was it German? Might have been a little tricky to pick up, but it in fact is in French. And if we remember, this makes a lot of sense because Calvin was in Switzerland, which has both French-speaking and German-speaking peoples. How about the texture? That's right. Even though there's a whole bunch of people singing, they're only singing one line. That means that it's monophonic. How about the form? Did you hear the repeat in it? If not, go back and listen to it again and see if you can pick up the repeat. This is an example of something called psalmody, which specifically was the only thing really allowed, and any type of music allowed, in the Calvinist tradition. It's the singing of psalms, and specifically the 150 poems in praise of God from the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Christian Old Testament. This was the only music that was allowed in the Calvinist tradition. And it had to be monophonic. It had to be in the vernacular language. But it had to also be something that would really get out of the way of the music aspect and focus on the words. Here we're taking a different interpretation of that St. Augustine quote from the beginning of this podcast, and really saying music is dangerous. Music is something that might stir us to sin in some capacity. So we need to be able to use it to focus solely on the worship aspect of it. Thus, we are not going to have any instruments in it. We're not going to have any polyphony. We're just going to focus on the words and creating words that all of us can sing through a very simple melody. So psalmody is the singing of the psalms, and it's the only thing that's allowed in the Calvinist tradition. Okay, now we are going to move on to the Anglican tradition and a genre called anthem. Same question that we had before, but with a different group of people and the same options. How did the Anglicans feel about the role of music in religious services? Was it great, totally important, like Luther? Was it dangerous, like the Calvinists? Was it nice, but not really necessary? Or was it good, but you really need to leave it completely up to professionals? Not going to be super congregational. What do you think? Okay, well, let's listen to an example. Again, I want you to ask all the same questions of yourself. What's the instrumentation? What's the language, texture, form, and what kind of worship experience does this music create? This is an example by a composer named Thomas Tallis, and it's called If Ye Love Me. It's a little bit longer of an example, but I'll play it through so you can hear the whole thing. Okay, having heard that, can you go back and answer some of these questions? Instrumentation, language, texture, form? How about instrumentation? Again, it's all human voice. And language, this one should stick out to you pretty clearly. That's right, it's in English. So we can actually understand the text as we go along without having the text printed for us. What about the form and the texture? Is it monophonic? It's harder to tell. It's not monophonic, but is it homophonic or polyphonic? Perhaps go back and listen to it again and see if you can pick up on it. And what about the form? Was the form clear? Did you hear repetitions? Does it remind you of any other music that we've listened for this class? Well, looking back at this, we can really say that this is an example of an Anglican anthem, which is something that's used in their religious services. And it's a polyphonic sacred work in English for Anglican religious services. It's usually highly contrapuntal, which means that it's more in that little p polyphony column of the texture chart that we have you guys fill out. There are aspects of it that are going to be somewhat imitative, but there are going to be aspects of it that are completely independent from each other, that no one of the voices is particularly more important. And usually in this tradition, that it's going to be a cappella. Occasionally, as time goes on, they do start adding in other instruments, including some strings and some woodwinds. But this example that you heard was definitely a cappella. To summarize, we have this nice little chart, and I'll leave it on here for a little bit, and we'll put a copy of it up on Canvas as soon as we're able to do that. This is the music of the Protestant Reformation. We can ask ourselves the different genres. Who does the singing in this? What language is it going to be in? What texture are they going to use? And is there instrumental accompaniment? And again, if you have questions about this, we'll talk more about it. So this was just a brief overview of some of the sounds that correspond to the ideas that we talked about. We'll do a little bit more to connect these ideas in section this week. But if you want to hear more examples of this, I will post the names again of all of these pieces and try to post examples that I can find on YouTube. If not, we'll see what we can do so that you can listen to them and try and figure out the relationship of the ideology that you studied in class and why this music might sound this way. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in class this week.